What does the cursed tomb of Genghis Khan truly conceal? Across the Mongolian steppe, where grass erases footprints in days and wind outlives memory, one unanswered question has outlived empires, religions, and technologies. A man who commanded the largest land empire in human history vanished without leaving a body, a marker, or a location, transforming death itself into a weapon of power. Armies collapsed, dynasties dissolved, borders shifted, yet the silence surrounding his burial remained intact. This was not negligence, it was strategy. The disappearance of a grave became stronger than any monument, turning absence into control and secrecy into legacy. What was hidden so carefully that even knowing the path required erasing every witness along the way? And why, after 8 centuries of searching, does the mystery still resist resolution? Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself and let's dive in. The man who commanded the largest land empire in human history did not leave behind a body, a marker, or even a reliable eyewitness. When he died in 1227, somewhere between scorched desert and mountain shadow during a campaign against the Tangut kingdom, the Mongol world did not pause to mourn in public. It closed inward. Death for this ruler was not an ending to be announced, but a vulnerability to be sealed. His army continued moving as if nothing had happened, banners still flying, orders still issued in his name, conquest uninterrupted. The illusion of immortality was maintained because hesitation would have fractured authority, and authority was the only thing holding a continent together. The logistics alone bordered on the impossible. A body had to be transported across weeks of hostile terrain, under summer heat, through regions recently devastated by war. Decomposition was not merely a biological problem, but a political one. Any sign of weakness, any rumor that the great Khan was dead, could trigger rebellion among newly subjugated peoples. The solution was brutal efficiency. The funeral procession moved without witnesses. Every living being that crossed its path was eliminated, not enslaved, not interrogated, but erased. Men, women, children, travelers, shepherds, entire families vanished so that a route would never exist in memory. This was not random cruelty, it was information control in its most primitive and effective form. Persian chroniclers writing decades later describe thousands of such killings, emphasizing not bloodlust, but intent. A secret survives only if no one remains to tell it. When the procession finally reached its destination, somewhere in the Khenti mountain region, the final layer of silence was applied. Those who dug the grave were executed. The soldiers who guarded the site were executed. Even elite warriors who had escorted the body met the same fate. The circle of knowledge was narrowed to a handful of commanders and family members who swore oaths that bound them beyond death, promising to transmit the truth only in whispers, only at the edge of their own lives, and only to those deemed worthy. The burial itself rejected everything the world associates with power. No pyramid rose above the earth. No tumulus broke the horizon. Horses were driven repeatedly over the site, thousands of hooves compressing soil, destroying the geometry of disturbance. Grass was allowed to reclaim the scar, or trees were planted to confuse time. Within a few seasons, the land looked ordinary. Within a generation, it became invisible. The absence was deliberate. Monuments invite curiosity. Emptiness discourages it. Official explanations emerged later, wrapped in spiritual language. Mongol belief held that a great ruler did not vanish at death, but crossed into the realm of spirits, becoming a guardian of the people. His physical remains were sacred, and disturbing them would fracture the connection between the living and the unseen. In this worldview, the tomb was not meant to be visited, honored, or even remembered in location. It was meant to dissolve into the land, the way a river disappears into soil before re-emerging elsewhere. But theology rarely tells the whole story, especially in empires built on precision and pragmatism. There were other reasons to hide a body so completely. Wealth was one. Decades of conquest had funneled unimaginable treasure into Mongol hands. Gold from China, silver from Persia, jewels from Central Asia, tribute from kingdoms that no longer existed. Some of it paid armies and administrators, but a vast portion remained the personal property of the Khan. Mongol funerary custom demanded that the dead be equipped for the next world, supplied with weapons, armor, horses, and servants. If this ruler followed tradition, his grave would contain not symbolic offerings but a concentration of wealth beyond precedent. In modern terms, the value would be measured not in millions but in billions. Yet treasure alone does not justify this level of annihilation and secrecy. History is filled with rich tombs, looted despite curses and guards. Something else was being protected. The Mongol war machine was not merely violent, it was intellectually adaptive. Nomadic horsemen defeated sedentary civilizations not by numbers alone but through systems. They coordinated across distances that paralyzed medieval armies. They gathered intelligence, used psychological warfare, staged feigned retreats, and struck where enemies felt safest. Siege engines appeared where no one expected nomads to possess engineering knowledge. Weapons using incendiary mixtures clung to stone and refused to be extinguished by water. Primitive explosives produced thunder and smoke that shattered morale before walls fell. These techniques did not emerge from nothing. The Mongols absorbed expertise. Skilled artisans, engineers, doctors, and scholars were spared and relocated. Cities were destroyed, but minds were harvested. Over time, knowledge from China, Persia, the Islamic world, and even fragments of European technique converged under one command structure. Think of it as a moving archive, not bound in books, but embodied in people and prototypes. By the end of his life, the Khan controlled the most diverse concentration of applied knowledge on Earth. What happens to such a collection when its owner dies? Manuscripts decay. People age, but objects endure. Metal survives centuries. Stone survives millennia. There are whispers that what was buried was not paper, but artifacts, devices, models, and inscribed plates designed to outlast empires. If even a fraction of this is true, the grave would not be a vault of wealth, but a time capsule of lost innovation. Metallurgy ahead of its era. Medical instruments unknown to medieval Europe. Astronomical tools capable of predicting eclipses using calibrated circles and sighting arms that translate sky into mathematics. Then the tone shifts and the whispers become darker. Among Mongol shamans, stories persisted of communication with Tengri, the eternal blue sky, a concept less like a god and more like an all-encompassing order. In these stories, the Khan was not merely favored but chosen, granted strength in exchange for a price. That price was not paid in life, but in death. His spirit did not rest. It was bound as a guardian, not only of a tomb but of something beneath it, an entrance, a deeper structure predating the Mongols themselves, discovered during campaigns and sealed again once its purpose was fulfilled. Such claims sound fantastical until patterns are examined. Every serious attempt to locate the grave ends the same way, not with quiet failure but with disruption. Expeditions collapse under unexplained illness, equipment fails without clear cause, funding evaporates, people die in accidents that resist simple explanation. The 20th century offers no shortage of examples, from early Soviet efforts dismissed as superstition to later technologically sophisticated searches halted by tragedy. The language changes, but the outcome does not. At some point, coincidence becomes inadequate. Either the burial site was chosen with almost supernatural precision, or a system exists that actively prevents discovery. That system does not need to be mystical. It can be social, biological, psychological, or political. Ancient pathogens sealed in darkness, unstable geology, local taboos enforced with quiet resolve, or deliberate interference by those who believe the secret must remain buried to preserve identity, sovereignty, or balance. The disappearance of the Khan was not an accident of history. It was the final act of conquest turned inward, a campaign against time itself. By denying the world a body, he denied it closure. As long as the grave remains unknown, speculation thrives, fear persists, and myth retains power. He conquered land while alive. In death, he conquered memory. And whatever lies beneath the steppe, whether gold, knowledge, or something far stranger, has been guarded not by stone walls, but by a strategy as ruthless and effective as any he employed in life. Centuries passed, empires fractured, and the Mongol world that once moved as a single organism splintered into khanates, each fighting to inherit fragments of former glory. Yet the silence surrounding the grave never broke. Instead, it evolved. What began as a physical secrecy enforced by violence transformed into a layered system of misdirection. Conflicting accounts appeared in chronicles written by outsiders who never saw the burial and insiders who never spoke plainly. One source placed the death in the mountains, another in the steppe, another far from Mongolia altogether. Each version sounded plausible. Together they created noise so dense that truth dissolved inside it. Chinese records suggested the Khan died during the Tangut campaign and was buried near where he fell, implying the grave lay within what is now northern China. Persian historians claimed the body was transported back to ancestral lands, but disagreed on the route. Some Mongol oral traditions insisted he returned to the Onon river valley, sacred to his clan. Others whispered of a burial near Burkant Khaldun, the mountain that had once saved his life and to which he owed a spiritual debt. These contradictions were not errors. They functioned like decoys, each pointing searchers confidently in the wrong direction. This strategy mirrors something familiar in modern intelligence work: compartmentalization and false positives. If multiple false targets exist, even correct information becomes suspect. An archaeologist confident in one source is contradicted by another. Debate replaces progress. Funding committees hesitate. Years are lost arguing over texts while the ground remains untouched. The Mongols, intentionally or not, created an information minefield that remains active 8 centuries later. The terrain itself cooperates with deception. The Khenti region is not a single landscape, but a mosaic of forests, ridges, valleys, and hidden basins. Seasonal changes rewrite it constantly. Summer growth erases scars, winter snow levels contours, rivers shift. What looks accessible one year becomes impassable the next. Even if someone stood above the exact location centuries ago, returning to it without precise markers would be nearly impossible. The land does not preserve memory, it deletes it. This erasure is amplified by cultural restraint. For generations, local communities treated certain areas as forbidden, not fenced, but avoided. These were not marked on maps. Children were taught not to wander there. Herders diverted flocks without explanation. Hunters chose longer routes. Outsiders often interpreted this as superstition, but it functioned as a living boundary. No one dug where no one walked. Over time, avoidance became habit, and habit became tradition. Tradition is stronger than law because it does not need enforcement. When modern archaeology arrived, it collided with this invisible wall. Early expeditions approached the problem with confidence in science and technology, assuming the past could be extracted if searched hard enough. They underestimated the power of silence maintained across generations. Local guides withheld information without lying. Directions were vague, distances elastic. A valley could be described as close or far depending on intent. Mountains share names, rivers branch. Without realizing it, researchers were guided in circles. Even when technology advanced, the pattern persisted. Satellite imagery identifies anomalies, but anomalies are abundant in mountains shaped by tectonic stress. Ground-penetrating radar detects voids, but voids do not equal tombs. Every promising signal requires excavation, and excavation requires permission. Permission introduces politics. Politics introduces delay. Delay kills momentum. Projects stall, not because evidence disappears, but because patience does. Some attempts pushed past these barriers and paid a price. Teams reported sudden illnesses with no clear diagnosis, symptoms resembling infections yet unresponsive to treatment. Others encountered equipment failure so consistent it bordered on sabotage. Generators stopped working, batteries drained inexplicably. Communication links failed in clear weather. Each incident alone could be explained. Together they formed a narrative that frightened sponsors more than scholars. Fear does not need to be supernatural to be effective. Archaeology depends on funding, and funding depends on perception of safety and prestige. A project associated with death and scandal becomes radioactive. Universities distance themselves. Insurance premiums rise. Grants are denied. The site remains untouched not because it cannot be reached, but because reaching it carries too much risk. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if the grave is not hidden because it is hard to find, but because too many people agree, consciously or not, that it should remain hidden? Governments benefit from ambiguity. A discovered tomb would ignite debates over ownership, heritage, and control. Who decides what happens to the remains? Who displays the artifacts? Which narrative becomes official? These questions threaten stability more than the mystery itself. For Mongolia, the issue cuts deeper. The Khan is not merely a historical figure, but a foundation of identity. His image appears on currency, monuments, and national symbolism. Yet his power comes precisely from absence. He belongs to everyone because he belongs to no place. A confirmed grave would localize him, turning myth into coordinates. Myth is infinite. Coordinates are negotiable. Foreign powers understand this. Throughout the 20th century, interest in the grave often aligned with geopolitical agendas. Control of the narrative surrounding the Khan means influence over how Mongolian history is framed within larger regional stories. Is he a conqueror who ruled China, or a Mongol who subjugated it? Is his empire a precursor to Eurasian unity, or a catastrophe that delayed development? These interpretations shape modern diplomacy. A tomb would become a battlefield without weapons. This context reframes the so-called curse. It may not be a supernatural force, but an emergent property of overlapping interests, fears, and taboos. Each group acts rationally within its own framework, yet the combined effect is obstruction so total it appears intentional. The grave remains untouched not because of one guardian, but because of many, none of whom need to coordinate. Still, doubt remains. Human systems fail, secrets leak, traditions erode, and yet the silence holds. That endurance suggests something more than passive protection. It suggests design. Whether by the Khan himself or by those who buried him, the concealment was engineered to survive changing technologies and beliefs. It relies on land that forgets, stories that contradict, and consequences that discourage persistence. The result is a paradox. The more powerful our tools become, the less certain we are that we should use them. Every advancement increases the potential cost of discovery. What if the grave contains nothing but bones and rust, shattering centuries of expectation? What if it contains evidence that destabilizes identities carefully rebuilt after imperial collapse? Or worse, what if it contains something that proves the silence was justified? The unanswered question is no longer where the grave is, it is whether humanity is prepared for what happens if it is found. As long as that question has no answer, the ground will remain undisturbed, the grass will continue to grow, and the Khan will remain what he chose to become at death. A presence defined not by what is known, but by what is deliberately withheld. The 20th century did not approach the mystery with reverence, it approached it with certainty. Ideology replaced superstition, and science promised answers where tradition had enforced silence. When Mongolia fell under Soviet influence, the grave ceased to be a spiritual question and became a strategic one. Symbols matter to empires, and the figure of the Khan sat at the core of Mongolian identity. To control the symbol was to control the narrative, and to control the narrative was to control loyalty. Moscow understood this instinctively. In the late 1920s, an officially sanctioned expedition moved toward the Kenti region under the banner of academic research. Its public goal was modest: survey ancient burial mounds, catalogue early Mongol sites, expand historical understanding. Its private objective was far more specific: locate the burial of the great Khan. The man leading the mission was experienced, methodical, and publicly dismissive of folklore. Spirits did not concern him. Data did. For months the work proceeded uneventfully. Graves were found, but none extraordinary. Warriors buried with weapons and horses consistent with elite Mongol customs, but nothing that suggested imperial scale. Then the expedition was led into a valley locals avoided. The warning was delivered calmly, without drama. Elders said the place was forbidden, that nothing good followed those who disturbed it. The response was predictable. Archaeology does not negotiate with legends. Excavation began. On the surface, nothing appeared unusual. Then stone emerged beneath the soil, arranged too precisely to be natural. This was architecture, not geology. The mood shifted from routine to focused intensity. And then the sickness started. One worker fell ill, feverish and disoriented, dead by evening. Another followed, then another. Symptoms did not align with known diseases of the region. Panic spread faster than explanation. The expedition withdrew. Official reports blamed harsh conditions and infection, omitting the stonework entirely. The site vanished from records, but private journals told a different story. They described sounds at night that did not belong to animals or weather, impressions in the soil with no visible source, and a growing sense that the valley itself resisted intrusion. The lead researcher, not prone to mysticism, wrote that some locations impose limits no methodology can overcome. For a time, interest cooled. The Soviet state had larger concerns. Then came war. In 1942, while resources were drained by the largest conflict in human history, a covert operation was launched in Mongolia. Archaeology was not the stated objective, but equipment and personnel suggested otherwise. The files remained classified. Participants did not speak afterward. Several disappeared entirely, not arrested, not exiled, simply erased from administrative existence. The operation ended without explanation, and the silence deepened. Decades later, the world changed again. The Cold War ended, borders opened, and technology advanced. Mongolia emerged as an independent state, eager to cooperate internationally, but protective of its heritage. In this environment, a new expedition formed, funded privately and staffed with specialists trained in modern methods. Satellites, ground-penetrating radar, computer modeling of historical climate patterns. This time, the search was surgical. The team narrowed the area dramatically. Subsurface anomalies appeared promising. Artifacts surfaced that matched the correct period. Confidence grew. Media attention followed. Announcements were made. Funding increased. Momentum built toward what was framed as an inevitable discovery. Then one night, something disrupted the trajectory. A strange light appeared above the camp, not flame, not artificial illumination, pulsing briefly before vanishing. Every person present saw it. No explanation satisfied everyone. Workers began leaving. Fear does not require belief to spread. It only requires uncertainty. Days later, a geologist vanished during the night. His body was found at the base of a cliff, death attributed to an accident. Officially, the case was closed. Unofficially, doubts multiplied. The man was experienced, cautious, familiar with terrain. Colleagues recalled him speaking of voices, of a pull towards something unseen. The expedition continued with a reduced team. Excavation revealed a chamber, stone-lined, deliberate. Expectations peaked. This was the moment generations had anticipated. When entry was finally achieved, what lay inside defied those expectations. No body, no treasure, only a massive stone bearing symbols no one could immediately identify. It was not Mongolian script, nor Chinese, nor any known writing system from the region. It felt older, out of place. The chamber was not an end point. A narrow passage extended beyond it, descending deeper into the mountain. This changed everything. The site was not a tomb, but a threshold. Exploration halted. The risks were too great. Plans were made to return with better preparation. Those plans never materialized. The expedition leader died months later in a car accident under conditions that raised quiet questions but triggered no investigation. Funding evaporated. The site was reclaimed by erosion. A pattern was now undeniable. Each serious attempt ended not merely in failure but in rupture. Death, disappearance, suppression, or abandonment followed proximity. The closer anyone came, the stronger the resistance became. This was no longer coincidence, it was systemic. The question shifted from where the grave was to how it was protected. Physical defenses were possible. Ancient builders understood traps, collapses, false chambers. Biological defenses were plausible. Sealed pathogens can survive centuries. Psychological defenses were already evident. Fear magnifies error. Stress accelerates failure. But these explanations felt incomplete. Another layer emerged when examining behavior rather than events. Every time a discovery neared confirmation, authority intervened, quietly or overtly. Permits were revoked, access restricted, diplomatic pressure applied. No single entity appeared responsible, yet outcomes aligned. It was as if an unspoken consensus existed across cultures and governments. Some things should remain untouched. This consensus does not require coordination. It arises when the cost of truth outweighs its benefit. A confirmed grave would destabilize narratives, provoke claims, inflame nationalism. It would force decisions no one wants to make. In that sense, ignorance becomes a form of stability. Yet stability was not the Khan's ultimate goal. His life demonstrated relentless motion, adaptation, and disruption. It is unlikely he would choose obscurity without purpose. The secrecy surrounding his death appears designed, not accidental. It is layered, resilient, and adaptive, functioning across belief systems and technological eras. Perhaps the most unsettling implication is this: the system guarding the secret may not be external at all. It may be embedded in human behavior, curiosity tempered by fear, ambition constrained by consequence. Each failure reinforces the narrative, strengthening the barrier without adding a single stone. If that is true, then the grave is not hidden by earth alone. It is hidden by the collective decision, renewed again and again, to turn away at the edge of understanding. And as long as that decision continues, the silence will hold, and the Khan will remain where he intended to be, beyond reach, beyond proof, ruling not through presence, but through the enduring power of absence. At some point, rational explanations begin to overlap in ways that feel intentional rather than accidental. When repeated failure follows the same curve, confidence, proximity, disruption, collapse, it suggests a design that adapts rather than a barrier that simply exists. The protection surrounding the Khan's burial behaves less like a wall and more like a filter. It does not stop everyone at once. It allows approach, then applies pressure proportional to intrusion. The closer one gets, the heavier the cost becomes. This realization shifts focus away from location and toward mechanism. If the grave were merely hidden, modern tools would eventually expose it. Satellites can read surface disturbances, sensors detect voids underground, algorithms reconstruct ancient landscapes by modeling erosion and vegetation patterns. Time is no longer an ally of secrecy, and yet secrecy persists. That persistence implies the presence of safeguards that do not degrade with centuries. One such safeguard may be biological. Ancient societies understood contagion long before germ theory. They recognized that proximity to the dead could cause sickness, that certain corpses carried invisible danger. It is plausible that the burial incorporated bodies of those who died from virulent diseases, sealed within chambers designed to preserve pathogens. In an oxygen-poor environment, spores can survive for centuries, even millennia. Disturbing such a space could release agents against which modern immune systems have no defense. Early expeditions lacked protective equipment. Illness followed, death followed. The lesson was learned indirectly and passed on as legend. Another safeguard may be architectural. The Mongols were not builders of cities, but they were expert engineers. They employed Chinese and Persian specialists who understood load-bearing stone, collapse mechanics, and misdirection. A chamber that appears accessible may destabilize when weight shifts. A passage may funnel intruders into spaces where air thins or toxins accumulate. False floors, pressure triggers, and collapsible ceilings require no maintenance once built. Gravity does the rest, but these are only the physical layers. The more effective defenses are invisible. Cultural taboo is one. For Mongols, certain places are not simply dangerous but wrong. This is not fear in the Western sense, but imbalance, a violation of order. Such places are avoided instinctively. No sign is needed. The absence of activity is the marker. Over generations, this avoidance shapes the land itself. Paths do not form. Trails fade. Outsiders see wilderness where locals see boundaries. Psychological pressure compounds this effect. Working in a place believed to be cursed alters behavior. Sleep suffers, judgment erodes, small mistakes escalate. A misstep on uneven ground becomes fatal. Equipment neglected fails at critical moments. Stress weakens immune response, making illness more likely. None of this requires belief in spirits. The human nervous system is enough. Then there is social enforcement. Communities that consider a site sacred do not need violence to protect it. Information is withheld. Cooperation is selective. Outsiders are redirected politely, persistently. When necessary, authorities intervene through bureaucracy. Permits are delayed. Conditions change. Access is rescinded for reasons that sound reasonable on paper. No confrontation occurs, yet progress stops. At the highest level, political self-interest completes the system. A discovered grave would trigger international disputes. Who owns the artifacts? Who controls the site? Who tells the story? These questions threaten stability. As a result, states act preemptively. They discourage exploration without issuing bans. They express concern for preservation while quietly ensuring inaction. Silence is framed as respect. All of this suggests the secrecy was designed not to rely on one defense but on many, each reinforcing the others. Remove one and the rest remain. Technology can overcome terrain. It cannot overcome consensus. Funding can overcome distance. It cannot overcome fear. Data can overcome ignorance. It cannot overcome unwillingness. This design reflects the mind of a ruler who understood systems. The Khan unified tribes by aligning incentives, punishing betrayal, and rewarding loyalty. He built an empire that functioned without fixed borders or capitals by embedding authority in behavior rather than structure. It follows that his final act would mirror this philosophy. Instead of a fortress, he created a condition. That condition has endured longer than his empire. The Mongol state fragmented within generations. The burial remained untouched. This inversion is striking. Power built on violence decays. Power built on restraint persists. Speculation grows darker when considering what lies beyond the first chamber, reportedly found by modern explorers. A passage leading deeper suggests something worth protecting beyond a symbolic marker. Not a body displayed for reverence, but something meant to remain unseen. The stone with unknown symbols hints at a language or code not intended for casual understanding. Whether ritual, record, or warning, its presence implies purpose. It is tempting to frame this as mysticism, but that misses the point. Ancient societies often encoded practical knowledge in symbolic forms. What looks like ritual can be instruction. What looks like reverence can be containment. A symbol carved in stone can mark a boundary more effectively than any sign in a known language. Those who understand it know when to stop. Those who do not proceed at their own risk. This brings the discussion back to intent. Why go to such lengths? Wealth alone does not justify it. Legacy could be preserved through monuments. Fear of grave robbery could be addressed through guards. Instead, the Khan chose erasure. He removed himself from history's physical record. In doing so, he denied future powers the ability to claim him. A discovered tomb can be repurposed. It can be turned into a shrine, a museum, a political tool. An undiscovered one cannot. It belongs to no one. It cannot be cited as proof or leveraged for legitimacy. It exists only as possibility. Possibility is powerful. It keeps curiosity alive without granting control. It invites speculation without resolution. It allows each generation to project its own fears and hopes onto the unknown. In this sense, the grave functions as a mirror rather than a relic. The closer humanity comes to uncovering it, the more it must confront why it wants to. Is it knowledge, wealth, prestige, or the desire to conquer one last unknown? Each motive carries consequence. Perhaps the true safeguard is not what waits beneath the earth, but what the search reveals about those who undertake it. If that is the case, then the system is working exactly as intended. The land remains quiet, the stories grow louder, the boundary holds. And somewhere beneath grass that has forgotten all footsteps, the final command of a man who understood power better than most continues to be obeyed, not because it is enforced, but because it no longer needs to be. As the mystery deepens, attention inevitably shifts from defenses to content. Protection implies value, not symbolic value, but something whose exposure would alter balances far beyond archaeology. To understand what might lie beyond the sealed layers, it helps to look not at the burial, but at the life that preceded it. The Khan was not merely a conqueror who accumulated wealth. He was a collector of systems. Wherever his armies went, they dismantled existing orders and absorbed whatever worked better than his own. This applied as much to ideas as it did to people. Cities that surrendered were not destroyed. Their craftsmen were catalogued, engineers were relocated, physicians were spared, scholars were extracted and redistributed across the empire. This process transformed conquest into acquisition. Over time, the Mongol court became a convergence point where Chinese metallurgy, Persian medicine, Islamic mathematics, and steppe logistics intersected. No other ruler of the era commanded such a breadth of applied knowledge. Crucially, this knowledge was not theoretical, it was operational. The Mongols built bridges across rivers in days using modular techniques borrowed from Chinese engineers. They coordinated sieges using counterweight trebuchets refined by Middle Eastern specialists. They implemented census systems to manage conquered populations, drawing on administrative practices from multiple cultures. These were not copied blindly. They were adapted, simplified, and standardized for rapid deployment. By the end of the Khan's life, this hybrid system had reached a level of efficiency unmatched in the medieval world. It functioned without permanent capitals, without fixed supply lines, without written bureaucracy in the early stages. Authority traveled with riders and seals. Decisions moved faster than enemies could respond. This was not accidental. It was engineered. When such a system loses its central figure, it fragments. The Khan understood this. He saw the limits of succession and the inevitability of decline. His burial, therefore, was not about honoring the past, but controlling the future. Whatever he chose to take with him was removed from circulation deliberately. Wealth is the obvious candidate. Gold and jewels are easy to imagine, but they are also the least interesting. Wealth redistributes. Knowledge does not. A cache of artifacts representing the distilled innovations of multiple civilizations would be far more dangerous than treasure. Tools that reveal how things were built, measured, or healed could accelerate development unevenly if rediscovered. In the wrong hands, they could destabilize entire regions. There is historical precedent for this kind of concealment. Throughout history, ruling elites have restricted access to technical knowledge. Medieval guilds guarded manufacturing secrets. Priesthoods controlled astronomical calendars. Even early modern states classified navigation techniques. Knowledge is power only when scarce. If the burial includes physical embodiments of such knowledge, not texts vulnerable to decay but objects designed to last, then secrecy becomes a form of containment. Metal plates etched with schematics, instruments calibrated for observation, devices whose function is not obvious without context. These would survive where paper would not. Reports of unknown symbols carved into stone support this possibility. A script not immediately recognizable could serve as a barrier, readable only by those trained within a specific tradition. To outsiders, it would appear decorative or ritualistic. To insiders, instructional or cautionary. This dual function is common in ancient technical writing, where sacred language masked practical guidance. Another layer of speculation involves materials. Mongol weapons sometimes contained unusually high nickel content, consistent with meteoritic iron. Such metal resists corrosion and holds an edge superior to conventional iron. In an age before industrial refinement, access to such material conferred real advantage. If the Khan possessed a significant quantity of it, fashioned into tools or weapons, burying it would prevent replication. But material advantage alone does not explain the aura surrounding the burial. Oral traditions speak of visions, of guidance from the eternal sky, of a ruler who acted with preternatural certainty. These accounts are often dismissed as myth, yet myth frequently encodes psychological phenomena. Altered states of consciousness induced through ritual, fasting, or substances have been used by leaders and shamans across cultures to enhance focus, intuition, and decisiveness. If the Khan employed such practices, the tools enabling them would be considered sacred and dangerous. Certain minerals, plants, or compounds can alter cognition profoundly. Knowledge of their preparation and use would be closely guarded. Burying them with the ruler removes both the means and the method from future access. This possibility reframes the burial not as an endpoint but as a quarantine. Whatever lay at the core was not meant to be inherited automatically. It was removed from the succession process entirely. Power would pass to heirs, but the catalyst that amplified it would not. The effect of this decision is visible in history. The empire expanded further under successors, but cohesion weakened, coordination suffered, strategic brilliance became inconsistent. Over generations, the system lost its edge. The Khan's unique capacity was not reproduced. That uniqueness fuels modern fascination. People search not just for a tomb, but for an explanation. How did one individual rise so far, so fast, and impose order on chaos at continental scale? Standard answers cite charisma, brutality, and opportunity. These factors matter, but they do not fully account for the precision of outcomes. Precision suggests tooling, not necessarily supernatural, but specialized. If such tooling exists and remains buried, its rediscovery would challenge narratives about linear progress. It would suggest that certain capabilities appeared, vanished, and could reappear if conditions align. This is where resistance intensifies. Modern institutions are built on assumptions about the gradual accumulation of knowledge. Discovering a cache that contradicts this, showing advanced understanding concentrated in one moment and intentionally removed, would be disruptive. It would force a re-evaluation of how power and knowledge interact. Thus, the burial remains sealed not just by earth, but by reluctance. Reluctance to confront the possibility that history is not a straight line, that certain peaks were deliberately flattened, that some doors were closed on purpose. The Khan's final act may have been the most strategic of his life. By disappearing completely, he ensured that no one could fully claim his legacy. By taking certain elements with him, he prevented their misuse, and by surrounding the burial with layers of deterrence, he allowed time to decide when, or if, humanity would be ready to encounter what he removed. Until then, speculation fills the void. Each failed search adds weight to the idea that the secret is not lost, but withheld. And the steppe remains silent, not empty, but occupied by intent, waiting without urgency, because whatever lies beneath it was never meant to be rushed back into the world. The idea that the burial functions as a form of containment gains weight when examining how consistently access collapses at the moment of transition. Approaches succeed, surveys succeed, preliminary excavations succeed. What fails is entry. Thresholds are reached, then events intervene that force retreat. This pattern suggests that the critical boundary is not geographic, but conceptual. Something changes once intrusion crosses from observation into violation. In archaeology, the difference between non-invasive study and physical penetration is not trivial. Radar, magnetometry, and satellite imaging gather information without altering context. The moment soil is removed, systems react. Air enters sealed spaces, pressure equalizes, microbial ecosystems dormant for centuries awaken, structures shift, the environment responds to disturbance. Ancient builders understood this intuitively. They designed spaces that behave differently once opened. If the Khan's burial incorporated such principles, it would explain the escalation of consequences. Early surveys trigger nothing. Digging triggers illness. Entry triggers death or disappearance. Each layer enforces retreat through different means. This is not magic. It is engineering combined with human limitation. Consider air. Sealed chambers accumulate gases over time. Carbon dioxide displaces oxygen. Methane accumulates. Hydrogen sulfide builds invisibly, lethal in minutes. Ancient tombs around the world have killed explorers without traps or curses. A narrow passage concentrates these effects. One step forward becomes one breath too many. Now consider biology. Soil is not sterile. Buried organic matter fosters unique microbial communities. Some spores survive extreme conditions. When released, they infect hosts with no immunity. Symptoms appear unrelated. Diagnosis fails. Death follows. Early 20th century expeditions lacked protective protocols. Even modern teams may underestimate unfamiliar strains. The line between accident and defense blurs. Then there is sound. Underground spaces amplify vibration. Low-frequency resonance can induce disorientation, nausea, anxiety. In confined environments, the human brain struggles to orient itself. time perception distorts. Auditory hallucinations become common. Voices are heard not because something speaks, but because the brain misfires under stress. Those experiencing it describe the sensation as external, compelling, authoritative. It feels like being called. These effects have been documented in caves, mines, and submarines. They do not require belief to manifest. They require isolation, darkness, pressure, and expectation. A person already primed by legend becomes more susceptible. Fear sharpens attention but narrows judgment. Decisions become impulsive, mistakes follow. The cumulative result is an environment that punishes persistence. Not instantly, not uniformly, but reliably enough to deter repetition. Survivors carry stories, stories become warnings, warnings become barriers stronger than fences. This explains why no final breach has been documented, not because it is impossible, but because cost escalates beyond acceptable thresholds. Each attempt reinforces institutional memory. Committees remember previous failures, risk assessments grow conservative. Projects redirect focus. The site fades again. What remains unexplained is motivation. Defensive design implies anticipation. Someone expected intrusion. Someone planned for centuries of curiosity. This level of foresight suggests more than tradition. It suggests strategy extending beyond a single generation. The Khan's life demonstrated long-range thinking. He unified clans by breaking cycles of revenge, replacing lineage loyalty with merit. He imposed laws that applied universally, reducing internal conflict. He understood that systems outlast individuals. His burial reflects the same logic. It is not a grave meant to be honored. It is a node meant to be neutralized. Neutralization implies risk. What risk required removal so absolute that even descendants were denied access? Possibilities range from pragmatic to unsettling. One possibility is symbolic. By removing his physical remains, he prevented martyrdom, cults, and succession disputes centered on relics. No body means no shrine means no rival claiming divine proximity. Another possibility is material. Certain artifacts may have conferred disproportionate advantage. Their continued existence could destabilize power balances if inherited. Burying them removes temptation. It also removes liability. If successors fail, they fail without shortcuts. A third possibility is informational. Knowledge concentrated too tightly becomes dangerous when context is lost. Techniques without ethical frameworks lead to misuse. By burying tools without teachers, the Khan ensured that rediscovery would require interpretation, not imitation. This slows exploitation. There is also the possibility that the burial contains not an asset, but a liability, something unstable, something harmful if mishandled. Ancient societies sometimes buried contaminated materials deliberately. Cursed objects in myth often originate from real hazards misunderstood by later generations. Radiation, toxins, reactive minerals all exist naturally and can persist. If such a material were encountered during conquest, sealing it away permanently would be rational. Surrounding it with deterrence would be necessary. Attaching the seal to the most revered figure ensures respect. No one questions what is buried with a godlike ruler. This reframes the curse. It is not punishment for greed. It is consequence of exposure. Those who approach suffer not because they are unworthy, but because they are unprotected. The narrative of curse persists because it simplifies complexity into morality. Modern institutions struggle with this ambiguity. Science seeks to know, governance seeks to avoid crisis, culture seeks meaning. The burial sits at the intersection of all three, resistant to each. Technology will continue to improve, sensors will grow more precise, modeling will grow more predictive. Eventually, the location may be narrowed to certainty. At that point, the decision will not be technical. It will be ethical. Does humanity open something designed to remain closed? Does it risk destabilization for knowledge? Does it override cultural sovereignty in the name of discovery? These questions have no neutral answers. The Khan's disappearance forces confrontation with limits, limits of knowledge, limits of entitlement, limits of progress. The silence surrounding the burial is not absence of information, it is information encoded as restraint. Every generation faces the temptation to break it. Every generation retreats. That retreat is often framed as failure. It may instead be compliance. Until a moment arrives when the cost-benefit calculation shifts decisively, the system will hold, the land will continue to absorb disturbance, stories will continue to grow, and the threshold will remain intact, not because it cannot be crossed, but because crossing it has never yet seemed worth what would follow. As speculation intensifies around what lies beneath the steppe, another question emerges with equal weight. Who benefits most from the grave remaining undiscovered? The answer is not singular, it is layered, just like the defenses themselves. At the surface level, the beneficiaries are obvious. Modern Mongolia preserves an unchallenged symbolic anchor. The Khan belongs entirely to national identity, uncontested by coordinates, museums, or foreign claims. His absence allows unity. His presence, if fixed to a place, would invite ownership disputes that fracture meaning. But the beneficiaries extend far beyond national borders. Every major power with historical, cultural, or strategic interest in Inner Asia gains something from ambiguity. An undiscovered grave cannot be weaponized politically. It cannot be cited as proof of territorial heritage. It cannot be commercialized at scale. Silence prevents escalation. History shows how quickly archaeological discoveries become geopolitical tools. Sites are framed to support narratives of continuity, legitimacy, and dominance. A single inscription can redraw cultural boundaries. A tomb can become a pilgrimage site or a propaganda instrument. In the case of the Khan, the stakes are unusually high. His empire touched more modern states than any other pre-industrial power. Any claim over his remains would echo across continents. China understands this well. The Yuan dynasty ruled from Beijing, and modern narratives sometimes fold the Khan into a broader imperial lineage. Russia, whose territories absorbed centuries of Mongol influence, frames the period as both trauma and foundation. Central Asian states trace elite ancestry to Mongol rulers. Even Europe defines itself partly through resistance to Mongol expansion. A discovered grave would force these narratives into direct competition. Ambiguity avoids confrontation. It allows each interpretation to coexist without resolution. In that sense, the grave functions as a pressure valve, releasing tension by never forcing a decision. Academic institutions also benefit indirectly. The mystery sustains careers, funding, and public interest. A solved question closes a field. An unsolved one generates conferences, publications, documentaries. Curiosity thrives on absence. Certainty is efficient but finite. Yet beneath these pragmatic incentives lies something less discussed, the possibility of active suppression. Not overt conspiracy, but alignment of interests so consistent it appears coordinated. When multiple actors independently conclude that discovery is undesirable, Outcomes converge without explicit agreement. This phenomenon is well documented in political science. It is called tacit equilibrium. No one issues orders, everyone simply reacts to incentives. When a research proposal appears too disruptive, it fails to gain traction. When a permit risks diplomatic fallout, it stalls. When an expedition attracts negative attention, funding evaporates. Each decision seems isolated. Together they form a barrier. This barrier explains why even well-publicized discoveries fail to progress. Initial excitement gives way to caution. Review boards request additional studies. Ethical committees intervene. Environmental concerns arise. Cultural preservation arguments surface. All valid, all delaying. Eventually, momentum dissipates. The result is not censorship, but inertia. Inertia is far more effective because it carries no fingerprints. Against this backdrop, the persistence of legends takes on new meaning. Stories of curses, spirits, and guardians discourage amateur intrusion while providing cover for institutional hesitation. It is easier to dismiss a failed project as superstition than to admit political risk. Fear, whether rational or not, serves order. The Khan's burial appears to have anticipated this dynamic. By embedding the site within layers of cultural reverence, physical hazard, and informational ambiguity, it ensures that suppression does not require enforcement. It emerges naturally. This is not unique in history. Sacred groves, forbidden mountains, restricted archives all rely on shared restraint rather than constant policing. The strongest vault is one no one agrees to open. Yet restraint is not absolute. Pressure builds. Each generation believes itself more capable, more rational, more entitled. Technology reinforces confidence. The argument shifts from "we should not" to "we can." That shift has consequences. Recent decades have seen renewed interest framed through non-invasive methods: soil chemistry analysis, microdrilling, environmental DNA sampling. These approaches promise knowledge without disturbance. They present themselves as compromise, but compromise is still intrusion. Each technological advance reduces the margin of ignorance. Eventually, probability narrows. The site becomes statistically undeniable. At that moment, the remaining barrier is choice. Choice reveals values. Do societies prioritize respect over revelation, stability over discovery, cultural sovereignty over global knowledge? There is no neutral stance. Inaction is a decision. Action is also a decision. Both shape the future. What makes the Khan's burial uniquely powerful is that it forces this choice repeatedly without resolution. Every approach tests resolve. Every retreat reinforces the lesson. The system does not need to win once. It only needs to outlast challengers. The Khan outlasted rivals by understanding endurance. He fought wars he could finish and avoided those he could not. His burial reflects the same calculus. It is a campaign designed not to defeat invaders, but to exhaust them. Over time, attention shifts elsewhere. New mysteries arise. Funding reallocates. The steppe remains. This endurance suggests that whatever lies beneath is not meant for immediate consumption. It may be intended as a long-term reserve of meaning, power, or warning, something that gains relevance only under specific conditions. Until those conditions arise, the silence serves its function. It protects not only what is buried, but those who might misuse it. In that sense, the Khan's final act was not concealment, but stewardship. He removed himself from the world not to vanish, but to remain unclaimed. And as long as no one can point to a place and say, "Here he lies," his influence remains diffuse, untouchable, and strangely alive, exerting control not through force, but through the enduring discipline of restraint. The longer the silence endures, the more it reshapes how history itself is interpreted. The absence of a grave does not simply deny closure, it alters causality. Without a physical endpoint, the Khan's life resists containment within a timeline. He becomes less a man who lived and died, and more a process that began, expanded, and then dissolved without conclusion. This has consequences for how power, legitimacy, and memory function across centuries. Most rulers anchor their legacy in stone. Tombs assert continuity, proclaiming that authority survives death through lineage or monument. The Khan rejected this entirely. By removing his remains from history's reach, he ensured that no successor could stand beside his body and claim inheritance by proximity. Bloodline mattered, but physical association did not. Authority would be contested in life, not sanctified in death. This decision destabilized succession intentionally. After his death, the empire fractured not because of chaos, but because of controlled ambiguity. No son could point to a tomb and say, "I am chosen." Power had to be negotiated, earned, enforced. This delayed ossification. It kept the system fluid long enough to expand further under successors before inevitable decline. In this sense, the burial strategy extended governance beyond mortality. It shaped political behavior decades after the Khan was gone. Few rulers have achieved that. The absence also transformed external perception. Enemies could not desecrate his remains. There was no symbolic revenge available. Cities were rebuilt, borders shifted. But the man who caused the destruction remained unreachable. This denied catharsis. Trauma without closure lingers. It becomes legend rather than history. Legend is harder to defeat than fact. European chroniclers wrote of him with a mixture of terror and fascination. Eastern scholars framed him as a force of nature rather than a person. In Mongolian tradition, he became ancestral sky rather than flesh. These interpretations diverged, yet all were enabled by the same condition: no body to contradict imagination. The modern world struggles with this. Archaeology is built on material confirmation. It turns myth into measurement. The Khan resists this conversion. Each failed search reinforces the idea that some figures exist beyond excavation. This resistance has a side effect: it invites projection. Contemporary fears and ambitions are mapped onto the mystery. For some, the grave represents lost technology. For others, hidden wealth. For others still, suppressed history. Each projection reveals more about the present than the past. During periods of rapid technological change, speculation intensifies. The idea that ancient societies possessed forgotten knowledge becomes appealing when modern systems feel fragile. The Khan's empire, built without machines yet spanning continents, appears as proof that alternative modes of organization once worked. His burial becomes a symbol of that lost efficiency. At the same time, skepticism grows. Rational voices argue that absence proves nothing, that legends inflate coincidence, that modern failures are simply the result of poor planning or bad luck. Yet skepticism does not diminish interest. It sharpens it. Doubt fuels investigation as much as belief. This tension sustains the mystery. It prevents consensus. And consensus is what excavation ultimately requires. There is also an ethical dimension rarely confronted directly. Excavating a grave is an act of dominance. It asserts that the living have the right to dissect the dead for knowledge. In many cultures, this is acceptable only when the dead consented or when descendants approve. In this case, neither condition is satisfied. The Khan explicitly ordered concealment. His cultural descendants overwhelmingly opposed disturbance. Proceeding regardless would signal that scientific curiosity overrides cultural sovereignty. That precedent would extend far beyond this single site. As global discourse shifts toward decolonization and repatriation, such actions become increasingly fraught. Museums return artifacts, graves are reburied. The moral authority of excavation weakens. In this climate, disturbing the Khan's burial would be controversial at best, catastrophic at worst. This modern ethical shift inadvertently strengthens ancient protection. What was once enforced by fear is now reinforced by principle. The justification has changed, the outcome has not. Another subtle effect emerges over time. The mystery disciplines ambition. Researchers approach cautiously. Language becomes careful. Claims are hedged. This contrasts sharply with other archaeological races where speed and publicity dominate. Here, restraint is rewarded. Silence preserves credibility. The Khan's burial thus influences not only where people dig, but how they think. And yet, restraint is not permanent. Values shift. Crises alter priorities. In moments of desperation, societies violate taboos they once respected. If future conditions create overwhelming incentive, ethical barriers may erode. What kind of condition would justify intrusion? A technological dead end, a global crisis demanding new knowledge, a political realignment where symbolic power outweighs restraint. Under such pressure, the calculus could change. If that moment arrives, the burial will be tested not by curiosity, but by necessity. At that point, the systems guarding it will face their first true challenge. Until then, the grave functions as a quiet constant. It reminds humanity that not everything yields to effort, that some absences are intentional, and that power can be exercised through refusal as effectively as through force. The Khan conquered by understanding leverage. His final leverage was mystery itself. By transforming his end into an unresolved question, he extended influence into eras he could never have imagined. Empires rose and fell, technologies advanced, ideologies shifted, and still the ground held its secret. Not because it could not be broken, but because breaking it has never yet seemed wiser than leaving it alone. As time stretches forward, the mystery begins to interact with modern science in unexpected ways. Genetics, unlike archaeology, does not require a tomb to ask dangerous questions. It works backward from the living, reconstructing the past through fragments carried in blood. And in the early 21st century, this approach produced one of the most unsettling data points connected to the Khan, a genetic signature shared by millions. A large-scale study of Y chromosomes across Central and East Asia revealed an anomaly. Roughly 8% of men in regions once ruled by the Mongol Empire carried nearly identical markers, tracing back to a single male ancestor who lived approximately 800 to 1,000 years ago. The distribution matched historical boundaries with uncanny precision. The simplest explanation pointed to one individual with extraordinary reproductive success, supported by power and privilege. The Khan fit the profile perfectly. This finding did something archaeology never could. It made the Khan biologically present again. His influence was no longer abstract or symbolic. It was encoded in living bodies, quietly replicating across generations. Every 12th man in certain regions carried proof that the past had not vanished, it had multiplied. This genetic persistence reframes the burial entirely. If the Khan lives on through descendants, the body becomes less important. The genetic line is the true relic. In this sense, the burial is redundant. The man cannot be erased because he was never singular. He became a population. Yet this realization introduces new tension. If DNA can confirm identity without a grave, then discovering the body becomes less about proof and more about control. The tomb would not validate the Khan's existence. It would validate claims over him. That distinction matters. Genetic data belongs to no single nation. A tomb does. This may explain why resistance intensifies precisely as methods advance. The closer science comes to rendering the grave unnecessary, the more it is framed as sacred, untouchable, irrelevant. The narrative shifts subtly from "we cannot find it" to "we should not." Genetics also raises uncomfortable questions about heredity and destiny. The Khan's success is sometimes attributed to environment, brutality, or circumstance. But the sheer scale of his genetic legacy tempts some to speculate about biological advantage. Not superiority, but predisposition. Traits such as stamina, resilience, or leadership potential are examined cautiously, then dismissed publicly. The topic is radioactive. History has taught humanity where such thinking leads. Yet curiosity persists. If certain traits were amplified through selection under empire, they might still echo. This does not mean destiny, it means probability, and probability unsettles narratives built on equality. Here again, the burial functions as a limiter. Without a body, direct genetic comparison remains impossible. The living carry diluted fragments, not a reference point. The past remains statistically inferred, not confirmed. This preserves ambiguity and prevents misuse. The Khan's descendants are everywhere and nowhere. No one can claim him exclusively. This mirrors the effect of the missing grave. Modern technology continues to circle the mystery from different angles. Environmental DNA sampling can detect traces of human presence in soil centuries later. Microfossil analysis reveals patterns of disturbance invisible to the eye. Artificial intelligence models terrain changes across millennia. Each method narrows uncertainty without resolving it. The paradox grows sharper. Humanity possesses tools capable of locating almost anything, yet chooses not to apply them fully here. This restraint is not imposed by inability, it is imposed by consequence. Consequences ripple outward. A confirmed grave would trigger tourism, infrastructure, commercialization. Sacred land would become accessible land. The steppe would change. What is untouched would be touched. What is quiet would become loud. This transformation would be irreversible. Many Mongolians understand this intuitively. Preservation of landscape is preservation of identity. The Khan belongs to the land as an idea, not as coordinates. Fixing him to a point would diminish that relationship. At the same time, global culture demands answers. Mysteries invite exploitation. Each documentary, each speculative article pushes the boundaries slightly. Pressure accumulates. This tension reflects a broader struggle between extraction and restraint. Modern civilization is built on uncovering, measuring, consuming. The Khan's burial stands as a refusal to participate in that cycle. It cannot be monetized without being destroyed. It cannot be clarified without being altered. That refusal is rare. It challenges assumptions about entitlement to the past. It suggests that some knowledge is not lost but withheld, not because it is unreachable, but because it is undeserved or premature. Whether one accepts that framing or not, its effect is undeniable. The burial remains sealed, the narrative remains open, and the Khan's influence continues not through artifacts, but through absence. In a world obsessed with documentation, the undocumented holds power. The Khan understood this long before modern theory articulated it. By vanishing completely, he ensured that debate would replace certainty, that speculation would outlive fact. His empire collapsed, his genetic legacy endured, his body disappeared. And in that disappearance he achieved something no conqueror before or since has managed: control over how he is remembered, not through preservation, but through permanent uncertainty. As long as uncertainty persists, so does influence. The ground remains quiet. The data remains suggestive, but incomplete. And the line between history and myth remains deliberately blurred, exactly where the Khan intended it to stay. At a certain scale, secrecy stops being defensive and becomes instructional. The continued absence of the grave does not merely block access, it teaches behavior. Over generations, it has trained historians, governments, and institutions in the limits of pursuit. This lesson is subtle but consistent. Some questions reshape the seeker more than the answer ever could. Modern search efforts increasingly resemble rehearsals rather than invasions. Teams model scenarios, publish hypotheses, then withdraw. Conferences debate ethics before logistics. The language used around the burial has softened. Words like recovery and extraction are replaced with context and respect. This shift is not cosmetic. It reflects an underlying recognition that discovery carries obligations no one is eager to shoulder. Those obligations are not abstract. A confirmed site would require decisions about access, display, conservation, and narrative authority. Each decision would generate conflict. Local communities would demand control, scholars would demand study, governments would demand oversight, media would demand spectacle. No solution would satisfy all parties. The burial's silence prevents this cascade. In effect, the grave operates as a stabilizing absence. It absorbs pressure by not yielding. This is rare. Most historical unknowns eventually collapse under scrutiny. This one has not, despite unprecedented resources directed toward it. That endurance suggests a self-regulating system, one that discourages escalation by making escalation costly. Cost appears in many forms: reputational risk for scholars associated with failed or controversial expeditions, diplomatic risk for states seen as violating cultural norms, financial risk for sponsors funding projects that may never conclude, even personal risk as stories of accidents and illness persist regardless of explanation. Each cost reinforces caution. Caution, over time, becomes doctrine. This doctrine influences how the Khan himself is framed. He is increasingly described not as a barbarian or hero, but as a systems thinker, someone who understood leverage, delay, and restraint. His burial is interpreted as consistent with that mindset. He did not want to be found, he wanted to be effective after death. Effectiveness here does not mean fear alone, it means shaping long-term behavior. By denying the world a focal point, he prevented ritualization. Rituals ossify power, they turn dynamic systems into static traditions. The Khan avoided this trap. His legacy remains adaptable because it is not anchored to stone. This adaptability is evident in how different cultures continue to reinterpret him. In some narratives, he is a unifier. In others, a destroyer. In others still, a catalyst for globalization. None of these interpretations require a grave. All of them would be constrained by one. A body fixes meaning. Absence allows evolution. From this perspective, the burial is less about concealment and more about narrative control through indeterminacy. It ensures that no single version of the Khan becomes definitive. This is power exercised through ambiguity. Ambiguity frustrates modern institutions built on categorization. Databases demand fields be filled, museums demand labels, academia demands citation. The Khan's burial resists all three. It cannot be catalogued, displayed, or footnoted conclusively. It exists as a problem without a dataset. This resistance has led some to argue that the search itself is misguided, that the value lies not in discovery but in observing why discovery fails. Each failure reveals something about contemporary priorities, fears, and limits. The mystery becomes a diagnostic tool rather than a puzzle. Viewed this way, the burial tests humility. It asks whether humanity can accept that not all questions yield to effort, that some doors are closed not by force but by design. This runs counter to the dominant narrative of progress, which assumes that persistence always wins. Progress, however, is not linear. It accelerates, stalls, reverses. The Khan understood cycles. His empire expanded rapidly, then fractured. He did not attempt to prevent decline indefinitely, he structured it. His burial may be part of that structure, a way to ensure that future generations confront limits rather than illusions of permanence. This interpretation aligns with the Mongol worldview, which emphasized balance over domination. Even conquest was framed as alignment with the sky's will rather than personal ambition. Excess was punished. Hubris invited collapse. The burial, hidden and unclaimed, reflects that ethic. Still the question lingers, what if restraint eventually fails? What if technological or political shifts override caution? The system guarding the burial has never faced a unified challenge driven by existential necessity. If such a moment arises, the calculus could change. Imagine a future where climate instability, resource scarcity, or global conflict drives desperate search for forgotten knowledge. In such a context, ethical hesitation may weaken. The burial could be reframed not as sacred but as essential. The justification would shift from curiosity to survival. Whether the contents could meet such expectations is unknown, but expectation alone can be enough to force action. At that point, the defenses would be tested not by isolated expeditions but by coordinated effort. Yet even then, the outcome is uncertain. Systems designed to endure centuries are not easily overridden. Cultural resistance would intensify. Political backlash would escalate. The act of opening the grave could trigger consequences far beyond the site itself. This uncertainty reinforces the status quo. As long as the future remains unpredictable, restraint remains rational. In the end, the Khan's burial functions as a mirror held up to civilization. It reflects ambition, fear, ethics, and patience. Each era sees something different in the silence. Each era projects its own concerns onto the unknown. That projection is the true legacy. The Khan does not need a monument. He has a question that refuses to resolve. And as long as that question remains unanswered, it continues to exert influence, shaping decisions, restraining action, and reminding humanity that power is not only exercised through what is revealed, but through what is deliberately left in the dark. When viewed across centuries, the disappearance of the Khan's body begins to resemble a controlled experiment in historical memory. Remove the physical anchor and observe what fills the void. What emerged was not forgetting, but amplification. The fewer material facts remained, the more powerful the narrative became. Absence did not weaken his presence, it abstracted it. This abstraction allowed the Khan to transcend the usual life cycle of rulers. Most are reduced over time to statues, dates, and curated exhibits. Their stories flatten as evidence accumulates. The Khan avoided this fate by denying accumulation itself. With no tomb to excavate, no relics to authenticate, no remains to analyze, interpretation remained fluid. Fluidity preserved relevance. This has profound implications for how societies process authority. Physical remains invite closure. They signal that power has ended and can now be studied safely. The Khan's missing body denies that signal. Psychologically, this sustains a sense of unfinished business. He feels less like a past ruler and more like an unresolved force. This unresolved state is reflected in how his legacy resurfaces during periods of upheaval. In moments of national redefinition, Mongolians return to him as a symbol of unity. In moments of strategic anxiety, neighboring powers revisit his campaigns for lessons in mobility and coordination. In moments of cultural uncertainty, scholars debate whether he was a destroyer or an architect of exchange. The mystery adapts to the moment. A discovered grave would freeze this adaptability. Once physical facts dominate, symbolic elasticity collapses, interpretations narrow, debate ends. What remains becomes manageable and therefore less powerful. This dynamic explains why the idea of discovery provokes unease even among those who do not believe in curses. The fear is not of spirits, but of reduction. To find the grave would be to reduce the Khan to a site, a data set, an exhibit. That reduction would end a conversation that has been productive precisely because it never resolves. The Khan's era was defined by motion. Armies moved faster than news. Authority moved faster than resistance. The burial mirrors this motion by refusing to settle. It is not located, it does not stop. It persists as process. Modern culture struggles with this concept. Information systems demand resolution. Uncertainty is treated as failure. But some systems are designed to remain open-ended. The burial may be one of them. This design challenges assumptions about historical progress. It suggests that some knowledge is intentionally incomplete not because of loss, but because of choice. The Khan's burial was not forgotten, it was erased deliberately, then protected by conditions that make rediscovery perpetually premature. Premature does not mean impossible, it means misaligned. The system assumes that those seeking the grave are not yet prepared for what it represents. Preparation here is not technical, it is conceptual. It requires a society capable of encountering power without exploiting it, knowledge without commodifying it, history without weaponizing it. There is little evidence that such a society currently exists. Attempts to frame the burial purely as an archaeological challenge ignore this misalignment. They treat the mystery as a problem to solve rather than a boundary to respect. That framing ensures failure, not because the boundary is impenetrable, but because the approach misunderstands its function. The Khan understood function. He built systems that aligned incentives rather than relying on loyalty alone. His burial aligns deterrence rather than guards. It does not threaten punishment explicitly. It allows consequences to emerge naturally. This is why each failure feels self-inflicted. Expeditions collapse due to illness, accidents, funding loss, or political pressure. No single event appears malicious. Together they form a pattern that discourages repetition. The system educates through experience. Education through failure is one of the oldest forms of instruction. Over time, This education reshapes ambition. Scholars become cautious, governments become deferential, curiosity remains, but it is tempered. The burial trains restraint without issuing commands. This training extends beyond the site itself. It influences how other sacred or sensitive locations are treated. It reinforces the idea that not all heritage is available for consumption. Some is meant to remain intact, even if that means remaining unknown. In this way, the Khan's burial contributes to a broader shift in global ethics. It stands as an early example of something modern discourse is only beginning to articulate, that preservation sometimes means non-intervention. The irony is that this lesson comes from one of history's most interventionist figures. The Khan reshaped the world through force, yet his final act was withdrawal. He conquered space while alive, then surrendered it completely in death. That inversion is deliberate. It suggests that true control is knowing when not to act. As the centuries accumulate, the burial's power lies less in what it conceals and more in what it enforces. It enforces patience. It enforces humility. It enforces the recognition that some questions change the asker more than the answer. This recognition may be the true inheritance, not gold, not weapons, not lost knowledge, but a structural reminder that limits exist even in an age of abundance. The Khan did not leave instructions carved in stone. He left a condition embedded in behavior. As long as humanity continues to struggle with restraint, the condition remains active. The ground stays sealed. The silence holds. And the Khan continues to influence the world not as a body waiting to be found, but as a boundary that refuses to move. As the present drifts further from the age of conquest, the mystery begins to collide with a different force, future-oriented technology. The question is no longer whether the grave can be found, but whether future methods will make secrecy irrelevant. Quantum sensors can already detect underground voids by measuring minute variations in gravity. Neutrino imaging, still experimental, promises the ability to see through mountains without excavation. Artificial intelligence can synthesize historical texts, climate models, and terrain data into probability maps with unsettling accuracy. These tools do not ask permission. They infer. Inference bypasses taboo. It does not disturb soil. It does not violate sacred ground. It simply narrows uncertainty until mystery collapses into likelihood. And likelihood, once high enough, becomes actionable. This is where the Khan strategy faces its most profound test. The defenses built around the burial were designed to punish intrusion, not prediction. They assume physical approach. They do not account for a future where knowing replaces touching. Yet even here, the system adapts. Knowledge without access is inert. A site identified with high probability still requires a decision to act. And action remains constrained by the same forces that have operated for centuries: ethics, politics, fear of consequence. Technology accelerates awareness, but it does not resolve responsibility. In fact, advanced prediction may intensify restraint. When uncertainty is total, curiosity drives exploration. When uncertainty shrinks but does not vanish, caution grows. A site that is probably the grave but not confirmed creates a dilemma. Proceeding risks being wrong and violating sacred ground. Not proceeding leaves the mystery intact. In such cases, inaction often prevails. This is already visible in other contexts. Predicted archaeological sites identified through remote sensing are frequently left untouched due to cultural sensitivity. Digital certainty replaces physical discovery. The site becomes known without being opened. If the Khan's burial enters this category, it may, paradoxically, become safer. Once everyone knows where it likely is, no one needs to prove it. Proof becomes unnecessary, even undesirable. This outcome aligns with the deeper logic of the burial. It was never meant to be unknown forever. It was meant to be unclaimed. There is a difference. A thing can be known and still untouched if claiming it carries too much cost. That cost may increase in the future, not decrease. As global norms around cultural sovereignty strengthen, disturbing the burial of a foundational figure may become unthinkable. The ethical argument against excavation grows stronger as awareness of historical exploitation increases. In this sense, modern values complete what ancient strategy began. What was once enforced by fear becomes enforced by principle. However, there is a counterforce: scarcity. If future conditions create extreme pressure for resources, knowledge, or symbolic leverage, principles may bend. History shows that desperation overrides restraint. When survival is at stake, taboos collapse. This raises the most unsettling possibility. The burial may not be protected against curiosity, ambition, or even greed. It may be protected only against times of relative stability. In a future defined by crisis, the system could fail. If that failure occurs, the consequences will not be confined to archaeology. Opening the grave would rupture a narrative that has stabilized identity for centuries. It would force immediate decisions with no rehearsal. What is found, if anything, would be interpreted through urgency rather than care. Urgency distorts meaning. The Khan understood this danger. His campaigns exploited urgency in enemies, forcing rushed decisions that led to defeat. He would not have wanted his own legacy subject to the same weakness. The burial delays action until urgency subsides. It enforces waiting. Waiting is difficult in any era, but especially in one defined by acceleration. Information moves instantly. Decisions are expected immediately. Patience is framed as inefficiency. The burial resists this tempo. It belongs to a slower rhythm. That rhythm is increasingly alien to modern systems. This dissonance may be the ultimate defense. A world that cannot slow down cannot access what requires slowness. Even if the grave is mapped precisely, opening it would require consensus across institutions that move at different speeds and priorities. That consensus has never existed. It may never exist. In the meantime, the mystery continues to function as a boundary object. Different groups project different meanings onto it without resolving conflict. Scholars see an unsolved problem. Politicians see a risk. Communities see a sacred absence. Each interpretation coexists because the object itself remains silent. Silence is remarkably adaptable. The Khan's burial does not argue. It does not demand attention. It waits. Waiting has outlasted every empire that sought to define him. This waiting reframes legacy. Most legacies decay as relevance fades. This one persists because it withholds completion. It remains open-ended, inviting engagement without resolution. In the far future, when today's debates are forgotten, the burial may still be there, still unclaimed, still exerting quiet influence. Or it may have been opened in a moment of desperation, its contents misused, its meaning distorted beyond recognition. Both outcomes are possible. The system does not guarantee preservation. It only delays reckoning. That delay has already shaped centuries of behavior. It has taught restraint through consequence. It has preserved ambiguity as power. It has turned absence into authority. Whether humanity will one day earn the right to cross the threshold is an open question. What is certain is that the burial was never meant to be conquered. It was meant to endure long enough for the world to change, and until that change occurs, the ground will remain undisturbed, not because it cannot be opened, but because opening it still asks a question no era has been ready to answer. When the mystery is examined through the lens of failure rather than success, a new pattern becomes visible. Every serious attempt to approach the burial ends not in dramatic confrontation, but in quiet erosion. Projects do not collapse all at once. They thin, personnel leave, timelines stretch, focus drifts. By the time termination is announced, momentum has already died. This slow decay is more effective than any overt barrier because it produces no clear point of resistance. Resistance invites challenge. Decay invites abandonment. This mechanism mirrors how the Khan dismantled opposing powers during his life. He rarely relied on single decisive blows alone. He disrupted supply lines, fractured alliances, spread fear, and waited. Enemies collapsed internally before final confrontation. The burial appears to apply the same logic in reverse. Instead of attacking intruders, it dissolves their capacity to persist. Funding is often the first casualty. Long-term archaeological projects require confidence and patience. When uncertainty grows and public scrutiny intensifies, sponsors become cautious. Insurance concerns surface. Legal advisors intervene. Risk assessments inflate. Each step seems reasonable. Collectively, they make continuation impractical. Personnel attrition follows. Experienced researchers withdraw to protect reputations. Younger scholars avoid association with projects perceived as cursed or stalled. Teams lose cohesion. Leadership weakens, expertise disperses. What remains is insufficient to justify continuation. Public interest then wanes. Media cycles move on. Without new findings, attention shifts elsewhere. The absence of spectacle becomes its own deterrent. Projects die not because they are forbidden, but because they are forgotten. This pattern is consistent across decades and political systems. It does not depend on ideology. It does not require enforcement. It functions because it aligns with human behavior under uncertainty. The brilliance of this system lies in its adaptability. It does not need to prevent discovery outright. It only needs to ensure the discovery is never completed. Partial success is tolerated. In fact, it may be necessary. Partial success fuels belief without resolution. It keeps curiosity alive while preventing closure. Closure is the true threat. Closure would collapse the system. The burial also resists commodification. In a world where nearly everything can be turned into content, tourism, or data, it remains unmarketable. There is no site to visit, no artifact to display, no narrative to package conclusively. This deprives modern culture of its usual incentives. Without profit, persistence weakens. This resistance to commodification is not accidental. It reflects an understanding of how power evolves. Material power attracts exploitation. Symbolic power endures when it cannot be owned. The Khan's burial exists entirely in the symbolic domain. It cannot be seized, only contemplated. This contemplation shapes identity. For Mongolians, the mystery reinforces continuity without fixation. The Khan is present as ancestor, not as relic. For outsiders, he remains a figure of scale rather than a specimen. His story retains magnitude because it lacks detail. Detail shrinks giants. Ambiguity preserves them. There is also an intergenerational effect. Each generation inherits not an answer, but a boundary. This inheritance teaches restraint implicitly. children learn that some questions remain open not because they are unimportant, but because they are heavy. Weight accumulates around them, respect grows. This stands in contrast to many historical narratives where progress is framed as accumulation of facts. Here, progress manifests as accumulation of caution. Knowledge advances, yet action does not. This inversion challenges assumptions about intellectual maturity. Perhaps maturity is not knowing more, but knowing when not to act. The burial enforces this lesson repeatedly. It allows knowledge to approach a threshold, then applies friction. That friction is not constant. It varies with context. During periods of aggressive expansion, it intensifies. During calmer eras, it relaxes slightly, but it never disappears. This dynamic suggests that the system is responsive, not static. Responsiveness implies ongoing participation, whether through human behavior or environmental feedback. It is a living boundary sustained by interaction. Some interpret this as evidence of deliberate guardianship by descendants or institutions. Others see it as emergent behavior resulting from aligned incentives. Both interpretations lead to the same outcome, preservation through non-resolution. The Khan's burial may thus represent a form of negative space governance. Instead of governing through presence, it governs through absence. Instead of issuing commands, it shapes behavior by shaping what is missing. This concept has parallels in other domains. Laws sometimes function best when rarely enforced. Borders sometimes deter movement without fences. Silence can communicate more than speech. The burial applies this principle at historical scale. As time continues, the system faces erosion from one source only, indifference. If future generations lose interest entirely, the mystery could fade into irrelevance. But this seems unlikely. The Khan's impact on world history is too large to ignore. As long as his campaigns are studied, his end remains anomalous. Anomaly attracts attention. The danger is not discovery, but trivialization. If the mystery becomes entertainment rather than inquiry, restraint weakens. Curiosity shifts from respect to consumption. In such a climate, ethical barriers erode faster, yet even this may be accounted for. Entertainment thrives on resolution. The burial offers none. It frustrates the very mechanisms that would exploit it. This frustration protects it. In the end, the burial persists not because it is hidden perfectly, but because it is positioned perfectly within human systems. It occupies a space where action is possible but unwise, where knowledge is available but incomplete, where power exists but cannot be claimed. This balance has held for centuries. It may hold for centuries more. The Khan's final conquest was not land or people, but time. He structured his disappearance so that it would outlast his empire, his descendants, and even the technologies that might one day locate him. As long as that structure remains intact, the mystery will continue to shape behavior without ever revealing itself, accomplishing exactly what it was designed to do. When the mystery is pushed to its furthest edge, one final possibility emerges, less comfortable than treasure or lost knowledge. It is the possibility that the burial was designed not to protect something valuable, but to contain something dangerous. This reframes centuries of restraint not as reverence, but as quarantine. Ancient societies were far more familiar with existential threats than modern narratives allow. They understood plague without understanding bacteria. They understood radiation without naming it, sensing sickness around certain stones and avoiding them. They understood psychological contagion, how ideas spread panic, fracture loyalty, and destabilize order. Containment for them was not a metaphor. It was survival. If the Khan encountered something during his campaigns that posed such a threat, sealing it away would have been rational. His empire stretched across regions that preserved fragments of far older civilizations, some already collapsed for reasons unknown. Ruins in deserts, abandoned cities, sealed chambers. Conquest does not only reveal wealth, it reveals remnants. Imagine a discovery made not in Mongolia but far from it, a site uncovered during a campaign already abandoned, already feared, something powerful enough to matter, unstable enough to fear, and incomprehensible enough to resist use. The Khan was pragmatic. He did not need to understand everything to act decisively. If a threat could not be controlled, it could be buried. Burying it beneath his own grave would solve multiple problems at once. It would attach the containment to the most sacred figure imaginable. It would ensure perpetual protection through cultural taboo. It would discourage intrusion more effectively than secrecy alone. No one would dare disturb what was bound to the Khan himself. This theory aligns with the extreme measures taken during burial. The systematic elimination of witnesses exceeds what would be necessary to protect wealth or legacy. It makes more sense if knowledge itself was considered dangerous. If understanding the location was enough to invite misuse, then eliminating witnesses becomes containment. The unknown symbols reported in a buried chamber reinforce this possibility. They do not resemble standard writing. They appear more like warnings or markers than records. Ancient containment sites often employ symbolic language not to inform but to deter. A symbol does not need to be understood to be obeyed, it only needs to feel wrong. If the burial is a containment site, then every failure to access it becomes a success of design. Illness, accidents, retreat, political obstruction, each serves the same function. They prevent exposure. This reframes the so-called curse. It is not punishment for greed, it is consequence of proximity. Those who approach experience harm not because they are unworthy, but because the environment is hostile by design. Such environments exist. Natural uranium deposits emit radiation that sickens those who linger. Volcanic regions release gases that kill silently. Fungal spores in sealed caves overwhelm immune systems. These dangers do not discriminate, they simply act. Ancient builders learned to recognize these hazards without measuring them. They marked dangerous places as sacred, forbidden, or cursed. The language was symbolic, but the function was practical. Fear enforced distance. The Khan, who absorbed knowledge across cultures, would have understood this logic. His burial may represent the largest application of it in history. If so, the system guarding the site is not weakening. It is working exactly as intended. Each generation rediscovers the boundary and retreats. Each new technology approaches with confidence and leaves with caution. The pattern persists because the threat persists. This possibility also explains why no definitive discovery has been suppressed aggressively. There is no need. The danger does the work. Human institutions only need to avoid interfering. In this context, restraint is not virtue, it is instinct. Modern society struggles with this framing because it conflicts with a core belief that knowledge is always beneficial. History suggests otherwise. Knowledge without context destroys. Power without restraint destabilizes. The Khan's campaigns demonstrated this brutally. His burial may represent an attempt to prevent a similar outcome in death. If the site contains something fundamentally destabilizing, biological, chemical, psychological, or conceptual, then leaving it buried is not ignorance. It is wisdom. The question then becomes whether humanity is capable of recognizing that wisdom before forcing exposure. So far, the answer appears to be yes, not through enlightenment, but through fear and friction. Fear is often dismissed as primitive, but it has kept countless communities alive. The fear surrounding the burial has preserved something for centuries. Whether that something is a treasure, a lesson, or a danger remains unknown, but preservation itself is a result. This interpretation casts the Khan not as a tyrant clinging to control, but as a strategist managing risk beyond his lifespan. He understood that future generations might not share his judgment. By embedding the burial within layers of deterrence, he ensured that any attempt to access it would face resistance proportional to ignorance. Ignorance is dangerous when combined with confidence. The burial strips confidence away. It replaces it with hesitation. That hesitation saves lives. Even now, as speculation grows more elaborate, action remains restrained. The system holds. If one day the threshold is crossed, it will not be because curiosity triumphed. It will be because restraint failed. And if restraint fails, the consequences will reveal whether the burial was a gift withheld or a danger successfully contained. Until then, the steppe remains quiet, not empty, but vigilant. The silence is not absence, it is warning, encoded in land, story, and consequence. And as long as that warning continues to be understood, the burial will remain what it has always been, not a mystery waiting to be solved, but a boundary humanity has not yet chosen to cross. At the edge of every long mystery lies a final tension, not between truth and falsehood, but between revelation and consequence. By this stage, the question of the burial is no longer archaeological, historical, or even ethical in isolation. It has become existential. What does it mean for a civilization to encounter something it deliberately postponed for centuries? The Khan's disappearance has functioned as a delayed mirror. Each era approaches it believing itself uniquely capable of resolution, only to discover its own limitations reflected back. Medieval chroniclers lacked access. Early modern scholars lacked tools. 20th century states lacked restraint. The present lacks consensus. Each shortcoming becomes part of the system that preserves the silence. What distinguishes the current moment from all previous ones is not capability, but acceleration. Humanity now operates in compressed time. Decisions are expected instantly. Delays are treated as failures. Reflection is framed as inefficiency. In such a climate, a mystery that demands patience becomes increasingly disruptive. Disruption invites resolution. Resolution invites force. Yet force is precisely what the burial has resisted most effectively, not through violence, but through attrition. It exhausts momentum rather than confronting it. It drains urgency until nothing remains to drive action. This method aligns with a deeper truth about power. Force compels compliance briefly. Structure shapes behavior indefinitely. The Khan mastered both in life. In death, he relied entirely on the latter. The structure surrounding the burial has no single architect alive today. It is maintained by incentives rather than commands. Scholars hesitate because careers are fragile. Governments hesitate because legitimacy is fragile. Communities hesitate because identity is fragile. Fragility produces caution. Caution preserves silence. There is an irony here. The Khan's campaigns were among the most violent in history. Millions died, cities burned, entire cultures were displaced. And yet, his final legacy may be restraint, not moral restraint, but strategic restraint. He removed himself from the cycle of vengeance and exploitation that consumes the dead. This removal forces the living to confront their own impulses. Do they seek understanding or possession? Do they value knowledge or dominance? Do they approach the past as inheritance or as resource? The burial does not answer these questions. It waits for the answers to emerge from behavior. Behavior so far suggests ambivalence. Humanity advances technology while arguing ethics. It celebrates discovery while condemning exploitation. It demands transparency while protecting secrecy. The burial exists at the intersection of these contradictions. That intersection is unstable. Eventually, something will give. If the burial is ever opened, it will not be because someone finally solved the puzzle. It will be because enough people agreed that the cost of not knowing outweighed the cost of knowing. That agreement has not yet formed. When it does, the act will mark a turning point, not in archaeology, but in self-perception. It will signal that humanity believes itself ready to absorb consequences without retreating into denial. Readiness is not measured by tools, it is measured by restraint, exercised when action is possible. On that scale, the verdict remains unclear. Until readiness is demonstrated, the burial remains sealed by default. No guardian stands watch, no wall blocks entry, only hesitation persists. Hesitation is often framed as weakness. In this case, it may be the strongest force at work. The Khan understood this. His empire moved decisively when advantage was clear and waited when it was not. He did not confuse action with wisdom. He knew when to strike and when to withdraw. His burial reflects that judgment extended across centuries. By denying the world his body, he denied it closure. By denying closure, he denied exploitation. By denying exploitation, he preserved ambiguity. Ambiguity preserved influence. This chain has not broken. The final lesson embedded in the mystery may be this: not all power is meant to be accessed. Some power exists to test discipline, not to be wielded. The burial tests whether humanity can coexist with unanswered questions without turning them into obsessions or weapons. So far, the test continues. The steppe remains unchanged. Grass grows, seasons cycle. Beneath it all, something endures, not because it is hidden perfectly, but because it has never yet met a moment when revelation would improve the world more than silence already has. Whether such a moment will ever arrive remains unknown. And that uncertainty, sustained deliberately across generations, may be the Khan's most enduring conquest, shaping the future not through command, but through the quiet, relentless discipline of waiting. In the end, the mystery does not close with discovery or denial. It settles into something more enduring, a condition that defines how the past interacts with the future. The burial, whether viewed as a tomb, a vault, or a boundary, has already completed its purpose without ever being opened. It has shaped behavior, restrained ambition, and preserved ambiguity across a span of time longer than most civilizations survive. This outcome challenges the modern assumption that meaning requires exposure. The Khan's absence proves the opposite. Meaning can accumulate through restraint. Influence can persist through silence. Authority can be exercised by refusing to be possessed. Every empire that followed him sought permanence through visibility. Palaces, capitals, monuments, archives, most of them collapsed under their own weight. They demanded maintenance, defense, interpretation. When those systems failed, the symbols decayed. The Khan avoided this entirely. He left nothing to defend. What remains is not a site, but a tension. That tension keeps the past alive without fixing it in place. It forces each generation to renegotiate its relationship with power, memory, and restraint. The burial becomes less an object of interest and more a measure of maturity. Maturity is revealed not by what a society can uncover, but by what it chooses not to. This distinction grows more relevant as technological capacity accelerates. The ability to do something no longer justifies doing it. Choice becomes the defining act. The Khan's final strategy anticipated this moment. He did not assume that future generations would share his judgment. He assumed they would be tempted to override it. So he designed a system that makes overriding judgment costly, confusing, and unrewarding, unless absolutely necessary. This system has not failed. Even now, with tools capable of narrowing uncertainty to meters, the decision remains unresolved. That unresolved state is not a flaw. It is the outcome. The burial has become a reference point for restraint. It is cited in debates about cultural preservation, ethical archaeology, and the limits of scientific entitlement. It reminds experts that some questions persist precisely because answering them would collapse something more valuable than knowledge itself. Collapse is irreversible. Silence is not. There is a final irony worth acknowledging. The Khan's campaigns unified vast territories through violence, yet his legacy endures through peace. Not moral peace, but structural peace. The absence of a grave has prevented conflict more effectively than any treaty. It has avoided wars over ownership, prevented desecration, and preserved a shared ambiguity that allows coexistence of narratives. That coexistence matters. History is not neutral, it is contested. The burial avoids becoming a weapon in that contest by refusing to exist as evidence. It cannot be cited, it cannot be claimed, it cannot be disproven. It remains outside the machinery of domination. This may be the most radical form of power imaginable. As the future unfolds, the mystery will continue to adapt. New theories will emerge. New technologies will tempt action. Each generation will approach the boundary convinced it stands at the right moment. Most will retreat, perhaps one will not. If that day comes, the consequences will reveal whether the system delayed discovery to protect humanity or to test it. Either way, the test will have worked. The act of opening the burial will say more about the world that opens it than about the man buried within. Until then, the silence remains active. It is not empty. It is full of accumulated decisions not to act. The Khan does not need to be found to matter. He does not need a body to exert influence. He exists as a structural absence that continues to shape behavior long after swords have rusted and empires have faded. That influence is subtle, but it is real. It operates wherever restraint competes with ambition, wherever silence competes with disclosure, wherever power is measured not by what is taken, but by what is left untouched. The steppe will continue to erase footprints. Grass will continue to grow. Wind will continue to outlast memory. Beneath it all, something remains exactly where it was placed, not waiting to be discovered, but waiting to be deserved. And until that distinction changes, the mystery will endure, not as a failure of knowledge, but as one of history's most successful acts of design.